my pleasure to introduce today's lecturer and moderator, Dr. Jennifer Furin. Jennifer Furin is an infectious disease physician and anthropologist who has dedicated her career to providing health care for the sick and poor around the world. She has implemented programs for patients with HIV and TB in resource-poor settings, including Haiti, Peru, Russia, Boston, South Africa, and Lesotho. Dr. Furin has worked with patients who have MDR-TB since 1995 and has treated hundreds of children with the disease. She currently leads the Capacity Building Task Force at the Sentinel Project on Pediatric Drug-Resistant Tuberculosis and serves as a regular consultant and strong advocate for children and families affected by this disease. I will now turn you over to Dr. Furin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evgenia, and thank you to everyone for joining the webinar. I think we're going to have a very exciting talk in the next hour, and we really hope to get some feedback and input from the rest of the group. Those of you who've been following these webinar series that we've had this year will know that we've talked a lot about some of the challenges and problems and really, what a dismal job we're doing in terms of getting children with drug-resistant tuberculosis on treatment and preventing drug-resistant tuberculosis in those children who are exposed. So it really gives me great pleasure to introduce our two main speakers. The first will be Lindsay McKenna, and Lindsay is an MPH, but really a very strong advocate for children affected by TB and HIV. She's currently working with the Treatment Action Group, who many of you know have done a great deal to raise attention and awareness about HIV and TB and drug-resistant TB, and Lindsay leads the TB-HIV project on pediatric tuberculosis. Speaking along with Lindsay will be Grania Brigden. Many of you know Grania from her outstanding work that she does with Médecins Sans Frontières. She's actually the TB advisor for MSF's Access campaign, and I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with what MSF has done to improve access for all people with drug-resistant TB, but Grania has also been a very strong advocate for children with drug-resistant TB, not just those who are sick, but those who have been affected and impacted by the disease. So I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful discussion led by these two amazing women, and I'm just going to briefly give an overview of what we're going to talk about today and then hand it over to our experts. So what we'd like to do today is discuss some of the major challenges in the diagnosis and treatment of children with DR-TB. This will just be a short overview for those of you who haven't been able to join us during the rest of the year. And as Evgenia said earlier, if there are any questions or if people want to view earlier webinars where we talked about some of these challenges, those are available. You can look on the Sentinel Project website. We then would like to review the current advocacy efforts that are going on that are led by TAG and MSF, and also some work we're doing at the Sentinel Project, and to really have a chance to discuss the future agenda and action steps. I know many of you who have joined this webinar are very active in improving the lives and health of people affected by drug-resistant TB, and we really like to hear input from you. As I mentioned, we talked this year about a number of challenges. Really, we need to focus on better estimates of burden of disease. We need sensitive diagnostics that can be run on easily obtained samples. We need improved prevention strategies, including preventive medical therapy for children affected by drug-resistant TB. We know we need better treatment approaches with effective medications where the doses for children are well known, and this is true not just for the existing drugs but for the new drugs as well. Any of you who've worked with children who have drug-resistant TB know we need more palatable and easy to administer formulations that are precise. We're probably really overdosing and underdosing a lot of the children, and we need improved psychosocial support for family-centered care. We're not going to talk a lot about burden of disease today, only to mention that it's really difficult to know the burden in children because they're not usually included in prevalence surveys. But this is a tough point for advocacy, because one of the first questions people often ask us, and I'm sure all of you who are listening to this webinar as well, how big a problem is this? How many children are affected by drug-resistant TB? And I will shamelessly promote a webinar that's coming up on October 9th that you'll hear about if you're a member of the Sentinel Network, that will be talking about some recent estimates of burden of disease, both from colleagues at Harvard Medical School and also excuse me, from colleagues at the Imperial College of London. But in the meantime, while we've been waiting for some discussions on burden of disease, there have been some very powerful publications using stories of children affected by drug-resistant TB as an advocacy tool. These have been jointly published by TAG and the Sentinel Project, and they are available on the Sentinel website. The first series of stories of children was called Being Brave, and then last year TAG and the Sentinel Project also published stories of children entitled We Can Heal. And what these stories do is they give a glimpse into the real lives of children who have been suffering and affected by MDR-TB, so that we know what it's really like for them. The numbers are important, but they often don't reveal the vast human suffering. So those tools are available, and we plan to keep continuing to collect stories of children who are impacted by this disease. Just briefly on diagnostics, we know that obtaining sputum samples or other samples from children is very difficult, and we're really hampered by a lack of sensitive and specific tests for the pediatric population. I have to say this is an area in which there have been limited advocacy efforts, and would certainly appreciate hearing from others on the webinar if you've been doing any work around this. In the short term, many of us are working to really strengthen sample collection procedures for pediatric TB diagnosis. These are things like induced sputum, gastric aspirate, nasopharyngeal aspirate, a lymph node aspirate, et cetera. And in the long term, there's a lot of effort going into supporting research and development. I say a lot, although there's very little funding for it, for research and development towards child-adapted, biomarker-based, non-sputum-based tests. And there was actually a meeting at the United States National Institutes of Health in May of this year where they focused on some of the diagnostic gaps. Oh, sorry. I pressed too hard. We know that we need to do a lot of work about preventing drug-resistant TB in children who are in households and who are exposed. And the good news is there are now several clinical trials being planned for children who are exposed to drug-resistant TB in the household. And these are being run through the British MRC, the South African Medical Research Council, and the United States National Institutes of Health is also planning some prevention trials. And those of us at the Sentinel Network are actually completing a handbook for household intervention. So this will be a very detailed sort of step-by-step manual looking at how do you do effective household interventions in households that are impacted by drug-resistant TB. The first draft of the handbook is done, and we're planning to pilot it in several sites, including in Peru, India, and South Africa. And certainly if this is something that you're interested in, please send a message to the Sentinel coordinators, and I'd be happy to loop you in as well. We've talked a lot this year about treatment and how to treat children with drug-resistant TB. This picture is one of my favorites, though, because it shows the pill burden that these children face when they are treated. But the large majority of children are never diagnosed or treated for their disease. So there are clearly a number of areas in which we need to do better, and I've often found that it's the advocates and the advocacy efforts that not only shed light on these issues, but help point us to pathways where we might actually address them. And so I'm going to turn the discussion over now to Lindsay McKenna, who's going to tell us about some of the important work that TAG has been doing, particularly around pediatric access to treatment for drug-resistant TB. So thank you, and Lindsay, it's all yours.
a pediatric component, and that's, for delaminid, which, it's not even really a completely new regimen. It's really just adding delaminid on top of the regimen we're currently using, or an optimized background regimen that we're using to treat drug-resistant TB. But as you can see, the rest of them, they're in late-stage development, and we don't really know what the pediatric component or plan is moving forward. As far as adolescent inclusion goes, you can see that just 2 of these include adolescents, even though there's no real biological or physiological reason for them to be left out of these trials once we know that, they're safe and efficacious, and they're completely, they're able to tolerate adult formulations. And so, what we hear from investigators when we encourage them to include adolescents in their phase 3 trials is we get a lot of resistance and pushback in that, they're worried that including adolescents in the protocol will delay its approval by their ethics board, or, will ultimately they won't approve it. And also they're worried about, the documented difficulties that providers face kind of retaining adolescents in care. And while those are, valid concerns, I'm a firm believer in that with a little bit of, advocacy and creativity, those are things that can be overcome. And so basically, the main point that I want you to take away from this slide is that we need to really be talking about the way forward for these regimens and combinations of novel and existing drugs in pediatric populations sooner. So, the sooner that we start talking about it, the better in the development pathway. Here, I just wanted to summarize, the research gaps, including what we talked about earlier, that we need revised dosing guidelines and child-friendly formulations for second-line TB drugs. We need data on the optimal role of each second-line drug in pediatric DR-TB treatment. We need data on the role of fluoroquinolones in treatment shortening for pediatric drug-sensitive TB. We need to optimize treatment for drug-sensitive and drug-resistant TB meningitis, and there was a great Sentinel webinar a few weeks back that I think it was recorded and it's up on the website if you missed it, about DR-TB meningitis. Also, Jen mentioned this as well, we need evidence-based guidance for preventive therapy in child contacts of drug-resistant TB patients. And so, how do we close these research gaps? And one main way is by increasing investment in pediatric TB research and development in general. And so another publication that TAG puts out every year to kind of support our advocacy is this tuberculosis research and development investment tracking guide. And it basically looks at all the money that's been put into TB, the development of TB drugs, vaccines, diagnostics, operational research, and basic science. And what last year's actually included a supplement specific to pediatrics. And they found that in 2012, only 10.3 million was actually invested in R&D for children. And according to the Childhood TB Roadmap, which came out last year, we actually, between 2011 and 2015, should be investing about $200 million to really get the tools we need to adequately address pediatric tuberculosis. So as you can see, that that's like $40 million a year we need. We're only getting about 10, so that's like a $30 million funding gap. And even beyond that, if we zoom in on how much money is being invested in the development of drugs for pediatric populations, is just 3.8 million. So that's really, really kind of a pathetic measure, and something that we can all advocate for is more investment. And finally, we have recommendations for things we would like to see in advocacy that we hope you'll join us in, and that's to integrate adult and pediatric TB drug research, mandate the earlier inclusion of children in TB drug and regimen development, include adolescents in phase 3 TB drug trials, conduct progressive clinical trials to speed research on and access to TB drugs for children, to develop a pediatric TB research treatment research agenda, to what we just said, increase funding for TB drug development, and finally to mandate the development of pediatric TB drugs. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Grania, and she is going to talk about some of the great work that MSF is doing around children with TB.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Jen, for introducing the presentation. So just please also feel free to ask questions as we go along in the questions for expert box, so that we can answer them at the end if you've heard anything that you want to find out more about. So I work with the MSF Access campaign, so the Access campaign, for those of you who may not be aware of it, works to get improve access to diagnostics, treatment and vaccines for the illnesses that MSF experiences in the field. And obviously one of the ones that we very much focus on is TB, and within that TB is a neglected disease, and within that pediatrics, the children are very much neglected within that cohort. So MSF has been trying to increase its work on treating both DRTB in adults and then within that DRTB in children. So we have a number of projects globally where we are treating drug-resistant TB in children. And what we're finding is that really the children do very well on treatment, and there's less issues with side effects. And I think one of the challenges we're finding is that often when we go to set up and do DRTB management in kids, it's the fear of the unknown. People think that children are going to be harder to treat with the drug resistance in kids is going to be harder to treat in adults, and therefore don't even try. So I think where we're able to do it and prove that children can do well, it's that in a way is advocating for further treatment of children. And also when you're treating DRTB in kids, and this is something that we focus on, is that it's not just the children. The children belong in a unit, in a family unit, and therefore you've got to really look at family-centered care, and more than just treating the children, it's you need the psychosocial support of both the kids and the whole family, and also to very much move away from some of the areas where we have started DRTB treatment programs in children. There was a background of hospitalization and centralization of care in children, which has massive long-term implications both for the children and for the whole family. So we've very much tried to move away from the centralization of DRTB care in adults and especially children. So for example, one of our sort of flagship DRTB programs for children is in Tajikistan, where we have set up a project in Dushanbe, and when MSF started there was no treatment program for DRTB kids in children at all, and so with the support of the Ministry of Health, we were able to set up a DRTB program for kids, and that I think shows that if you have the political will in countries, sometimes it's this fear or not really knowing how to start, but with the will of the MOH and people wanting to do it, it can be done. So in setting this program up, I think we've experienced, and I'm not sure how many people on the webinar are pediatric treaters but we found that I think is a global problem. There was real challenges with preparing the DRTB kids, the DRTB medicines for kids, and so we've done some work to look at to see how we can improve this. So I'll just skip. So when you're treating, when you have a child who needs DRTB meds, you're kind of left with how do you get the adult formulations into the child. So you can manipulate the drugs, so that's where you crush them, you mix them, you split the tablets, but that is not necessarily the most accurate way, and you do run the risk of under or overdosing children. So we've looked at doing something that's called compounding or extemporaneous preparation of TB meds. So this is different from manipulation because it's much more, well, it's more accurate. It's still not as accurate as obviously having a pediatric appropriate formulation, but it's using some of the sort of pharmaceutical skills to ensure that you try as best as you can to get the correct dose of a adult formulation of a medicine. So what you can see from the picture is that the top one is the sort of crushing on a spoon, mixing it in with the juice, which I think in a lot of situations where you don't have necessarily the pharmaceutical support and backup is one way to get the medicines in. But where you do have the facilities and the access, the lower pictures are some of the sort of tools that you need for compounding adult meds to make a pediatric formulation. And as you can see, it's still just a bit more accurate, so we can hopefully have a bit more confidence in that we're getting the dose that we need into children. But again, it's still not as good as a pediatric formulation. So why do we need to do this compounding? So these are what we've got now in the way of formulation. So out of the first line drugs, we're awaiting this new FDC that hopefully I think should be available within the next year to 18 months. But as Lindsay said, you know, we have got this long gap between the recommendations for the new dosages and then an actual medication that suits them. And then more for the MDR-TB medications, you can see we've only got 3 out of the 10 second line drugs, and actually one of those, the PASS, it's not a pediatric formulation of the medicine, but it's a adaptation made. So I'll show you, it's an adaptation made so that the adult PASS granules can be more accurately measured out to give you a dose for children. So and then for the third line drugs, or the sort of for MDR-TB, again we have a lack of pediatric appropriate formulations. And for the levofloxacin, although there's a pediatric formulation available, it's actually not recommended for children less than 3, and there are concerns about its long-term use in children because of some of the ingredients in the oral solution. So we're a long way off having the medications that we need for MDR-TB in kids. So some of the things that the Sentinel group have been doing, so we surveyed, we sent a survey out about a year ago now to find out a little bit about what drugs are actually being used and if there's a standardized preparation protocol, be it compounding, be it manipulation, but some way that people are trying to standardize how they give the adult formulations to children. What you can see is that sort of the ranges of drugs that are being used, but I think probably it's not necessarily the biggest, so I hope everyone can see, but the yellow line, so the top bar in each drug in the bar chart, is there a protocol for preparation? And for prothionamide, cycloserine, afloxacin and passodium, they're quite regularly being used, but there's no one reported a protocol to ensure that there was some standardization of how they were being used. And even the ones that did have a protocol, they were rarely being used. So I think that shows that we're all facing a lot of challenges with these drugs and that we need to have pediatric appropriate formulations of these drugs. So as a follow-on from this survey, the Sentinel group is working now on putting together a target product profile, so a TPP for what do we want from second-line drugs. So as we pointed out, there is now PK work being done on PK work for the second-line drugs, and so hopefully we should get the results of that soon, and then we need to make the right size of tablets for what the PK data shows. And for that, we want to make sure that we request a tablet or a granule or a syrup or a dispersible tablet that accurately reflects the needs and the wants of the people who are actually treating children, both from the doctors, from the nurses and pharmacists, from the logistics people, and then also we'll be taking input from the people who take the drugs, so the caregivers and the children where they're of an age to feed into this. So that's sort of work that we're doing so that we can make sure that when we have the PK data, we'll also have the appropriate drugs. And then this is just a little bit about just having the drug, and the PK data is just the first step, but this is not how there's much more to access than just having the product. So these are sort of the pillars really of moving towards access. So you need to make sure that we have the product available. So we have the product manufactured, and that we know what the needs are and how to procure it. The product needs to be affordable, because if it's non-affordable but available, then that's still not going to have access, and it has to be adopted. And some of the things and what we're working sort of has begun now is making sure that there's the PK data available, so that then the WHO can make the necessary guidelines, which can then feed into national guidelines, and then which feeds down into policy, and therefore all these things all have to happen. And only then will we have proper access to a pediatric formulation that is affordable and recommended for use in children. So this is sort of why we all need to work at whatever we do at various levels to work towards proper access. So I'm now going to hand over back to Jen to talk a little bit more about some of the stuff that's the Sentinel Project's doing.
Great. Thank you so much, Grania, and thank you, Lindsay, as well, for some very interesting discussions. And again, we would encourage people who are listening on the webinar to ask any questions or to share any ideas or thoughts you might have around some of these issues. So I'm going to try to finish up relatively quickly so there's some time for discussions and questions. But I have to say, thinking about the pediatric formulations has really been an incredible learning experience for me. I'm a clinician, and I tend to think very simply, and if there's a formulation for adults that's 250 milligrams and we need 125 milligrams for the child, wouldn't it just be very straightforward to make a tablet that contains half that size? But it's an incredibly complicated thing to get some of these formulations available for children. So one thing that's important to mention is that the pediatric formulations almost always cost more than the adult formulations. And so not only is it a matter of convincing a pharmaceutical company to do it and agreeing among the experts about what the dose should be and having that then approved and recommended by the WHO, but then countries have to buy these medications, and they're often unwilling to because they generally treat a small number of children due to problems with diagnostics and treatment, and the drugs are more expensive. So I sometimes feel like we're trapped in a very vicious cycle when it comes to improving the care for children affected and sick with drug-resistant TB. And this is really where all of us need to raise our voices and be heard, because without us, without you, I fear this problem is going to continue, because even if we are able able to get the formulations made. I'm not sure if I were a national TB program manager with a limited budget that I would buy pediatric formulations without a lot of convincing and support. So I did just want to quickly mention a couple other things we're working on with the Sentinel Project. So the first is something we affectionately call the Pudding Project. This is about manipulation efforts with some of the second-line formulations that Grania mentioned. Right now, a lot of people crush them and mix them with different things, but we don't know what happens to the tablets when they're crushed and they're mixed, or even when they're passed through a nasogastric tube. So we've been doing some work right now with Chuck Peliquin's lab, looking at the stability and the availability of global drug facility procured second-line drugs when they're mixed with common foodstuffs that are widely available in resource-poor settings, including things like yogurt, bananas, etc. I do want to quickly mention there has been some progress with one Indian manufacturer, and that's McLeod's. They do have a 125 milligram dispersible formulation of ethionamide, and they have made a 125 milligram capsule of cycloserine. So there's work that needs to be done, however, to assure that these smaller formulations have the same bioequivalence as the adult formulations. And a lot of this work can't go anywhere unless there are WHO recommendations on the dosing of second-line drugs in children, and to date there aren't any. Again, it's a vicious cycle. Without the WHO recommendations, we can't get dosing recommendations, we can't ask pharmaceutical companies to make them, etc. So Annika Hessling and her team are actually leading an effort right now to complete a meta-analysis and a review of the PK data that can be used to make WHO recommendations, and we're very excited. This has been a long effort, and there have been lots of wonderful people involved in making this happen. I just briefly want to mention a very simple idea that, we often do cut the tablets for children, but if the tablet is not scored, it means the medication is not evenly distributed throughout the tablet. So if you cut an adult ethionamide tablet in half right now, the 250 milligrams may be in one half, and there may be 0 milligrams in the other half. So even getting pharmaceutical companies to consider scoring the tablets and evenly distributing the medication throughout would be a big game changer for those of us who have to prepare these medications. And the final area in which we really need to strengthen our advocacy efforts is to really include childhood TB and childhood drug-resistant TB in the overall global child health framework. If you think about it, TB is almost never on the agenda, and when we try to make efforts to put TB on the child health agenda, it can be challenging because they want to focus, rightly so, on the biggest killers of children, which are diarrheal disease, respiratory disease, etc. But TB overlaps so much with these other issues. If you look on the malnutrition wards, and there's been some very interesting data published by Mohammed Chisti, who's with ICDDRB in Bangladesh, that if you look on the malnutrition wards and you look on the acute pneumonia wards, anywhere between 5 and 10% of those children actually have undiagnosed tuberculosis. So, these are very big overlapping issues, and often we're asked to keep TB out of them because we want to keep things simple, or simply because we haven't been able to make the argument there are enough children who are impacted by tuberculosis. So areas of overlap obviously are HIV, meningitis, and preterm birth, and we really need to work hard to get TB integrated into the maternal and child health documents, the plans, and as a colleague of mine noted, childhood TB needs to be on everybody's brain anywhere there are sick children and sick mothers who access care. Again, we'll be having a much more sophisticated discussion about the burden of disease on October 9th, but if you think about it, if we estimate there are about 500,000 new cases of drug-resistant TB each year, if we look at the number of sick children with DRTB, it could really be as high as 30 to 50,000, but the number of children who need an intervention is on the order of millions. Because there are about 2 children in every household, and children are infected and need preventive measures. They're affected as their parents or caregivers are unable to work. The households become more insecure, and there are sick children who die of this disease every single day. So we really need to improve our efforts. And I would just like to point out a document, which is the Roadmap for Childhood Tuberculosis, where the aim, and this is a very innovative and forward-thinking document, where we really want to aim towards 0 deaths among children. And so this is a tool that we'd like to see included in the overall global child health framework. It's been endorsed by a number of organizations, and we need to make sure not only that this exists. You know, we often have a roadmap, but then we never take the trip. So we really need to make sure that we implement the roadmap and that everybody's thinking about kids who are impacted by tuberculosis. So in summary, there's a lot of work that we need to do. And I have to say, I really am so thankful to have colleagues and partners like Lindsay and Grania and the organizations they represent, as well as those of you who are listening on the call, because we still need more to do. And we really need to be fierce advocates and be loud voices, you know, who won't be silenced as we really try to improve the lives and the health of children affected by tuberculosis and drug-resistant tuberculosis. We need to promote and ensure that there are consensus statement, target product profiles are not only created, but they're adapted and included. And we need to push for more trials among children and more funders of programs that include children. And as Lindsay mentioned, the overall funding level is really, it's horribly low, and we need to advocate for more funds for this. Our last slide before we sort of launch into a discussion, and I see we have some questions coming in, which is great, is, you know, there are so few children with drug-resistant tuberculosis who ever get diagnosed and who ever get treatment for their disease. We've talked a lot about the new tools that we need to develop, but right now, today, with what we have, we can effectively treat children with drug-resistant tuberculosis. Simone Scoff and his group in Cape Town have shown that we can actually prevent drug-resistant tuberculosis in children with prophylactic regimens in much the same way that we do with isoniazid for children who are exposed to pan-susceptible TB, and that we need to continue to push and push and push and get these children identified and put on care so that they can go on to lead healthy, normal, and productive lives. So in the excitement about talking about the new things that we need to do, we need to remember with what we have right now, we can already do a much better job for our children and our adolescents. I always have to bring up adolescents because they're often forgotten in the group between children and adults. And we know based on some early work done by some colleagues at MSF in Mumbai and also at MSF in Khayelitsha, that adolescents, those between the ages of 14 and 18, may have worse outcomes, and they often fall through the cracks. So I'm really excited that we were able to host this webinar today with such excellent speakers, but I really want us to take the remaining 15 minutes or so to answer some questions, but also to brainstorm a little bit about what our priorities should be. And for those of you who are on the call, if you could let us know about any advocacy efforts that you're involved in that we're not aware of. I think together we know we're all stronger than we are as single voices. So let's hope that we can join together and keep pushing so that our kids get better care. So I see there are a number of questions coming in right now. So I'm going to turn over to Grania to answer the first one, and then we can talk about some of the other ones as well. So Grania, over to you.
Thank you, and I'm glad that please do keep asking questions. So we've had a question in about the slide, I'll just take it back, where I was talking about what pediatric formulations of second and third line drugs there were, and it was noted that one of the members on the webinar, although there is a pediatric lidizinacid product available, it is the Pfizer branded product and is exorbitantly expensive, so therefore it may be available, but there is real problems with its price. And I think that very nicely highlights that having a product available is that's not access, and affordability is a very important part of that. And I think lidizinacid, there are many issues globally with the affordability of this product, both for pediatrics and for adults. And so MSF has done, in our South Africa projects, where the generic, so there's the Pfizer patented product, but there is a generic quality assured product made by Hetero that is available through the GDF at I think it's $8 a tablet. So that if If you have access to that, then that's obviously a big drop in price from the $35 per tablet for the Pfizer product. But in South Africa, there were patent issues that meant that it could not be used, and MSF worked to get an exemption from that, and that's some of the sort of advocacy work that can be done globally to try and get these products affordable. And TAG are actually producing an activist guide for which should be coming out next week. So that will also give more information about the issues. And I do know that there is no generic pediatric product for lisidinizid at the moment, so I think that's also another thing that we need to continue to lobby the generic companies, that as well as producing generic adult formulations of lisidinizid, they need to do the pediatric formulations as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Grania. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the next questions. So there's a question here on how to appropriately give the dose of cycloserine, and this is a great question. For those of you who don't know this medication, it's either available as a hard caplet that can't be split, or as a capsule with little tiny grains inside of it. What most of us do is that we try to split the hard caplet and then crush it up and mix it you know, with water or juice or pudding, or we open the cycloserine granules, the capsule, to release the small granules inside, and make a preparation where you might use 10 milliliters of water or some other thing the child likes to drink, or 25 milliliters, and put the 250 milligrams in there, and then you have a 10 milligram per milliliter suspension. So and some of this is actually discussed in our field guide for the treatment of children with childhood tuberculosis. So several of you have commented that it's important to get speakers from resource-limited settings who've actually had to deal with this, and I couldn't agree with it more. So we're always looking for people, and I also see that in Durban, Section 27 has been very active, so we would definitely like to link into them. There's a question about record systems and how they are limited, and this is certainly true in most settings. What we're trying to propose is actually that children who are in households with tuberculosis or drug-resistant tuberculosis get a treatment booklet or card that's very similar to what they get for the vaccine. So in South Africa, it's called the Road to Health card, where the families can keep this with them, and we can keep track of what's going on with the children. I'm glad to see also some comments from King Dinizulu Hospital that they have a large cohort of patients with DR-TB who are children, and we'd love to have them in there. There's also a comment here that the STREAM trial was initially trying to include adolescents, but there were challenges to enrollment, and we do need to understand the barriers to these. Enrolling adolescents in any activity can sometimes be challenging, and so I do think it's a great idea to think about what some of those barriers are. It would be great to see children included in STAND, and I'm glad to see they're still being considered. And the products that McLeod's are working on right now are a 125 milligram dispersible tablet of ethionamide, as well as a 125 milligram capsule formulation of cycloserine. So I do want to take a couple minutes. Evgenia has kindly prepared for us a couple, they're not questions, but places where we can type comments and share them. So Evgenia, if you don't mind putting some of those up on the screen right now. And again, I know the webinar's ending in a few minutes, but if people have comments on this, the first area we'd like to think about is what are some of the priorities in childhood DR-TB advocacy. And we've given you what we think are some of the priorities, but obviously we have probably a limited spectrum of understanding. So if others have ideas or thoughts on this, you can type them in here now. Or again, please let us know. We want this to be just the beginning of a dialogue that all of us can have together, and hopefully can spur us on to action. Many of us will be at the union meeting. We hope we can talk about some of this. But please feel free to contact us if you have any ideas about priorities that we didn't mention, or specifically if you are involved in any advocacy efforts that we haven't talked about or commented on today. We really want to bring everyone together so that we can be loud voices for our children. So I see some nice answers coming in here. We'd like to have connected records for shared data sets. Contact tracing is absolutely a priority, and many of us are working on that now. The pediatric formulations and the availability and access to drugs, these are all really, really key issues. And so I'm glad to see these coming up as well. And then we'll leave that up there for another minute so that people can keep typing. And I see now the idea of education and play programs for children. It's wonderful. We actually also found out recently that there are actually no TB materials that are targeted at children. So most of the TB training or education materials are targeted towards adults, both for tuberculosis and for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. So if you know of any information that we could hand to children about this, and Sentinel is actually working on thinking through some clever child-related materials and information and education targeted to children themselves. I think the issue of adherence is a great one to think about for kids. You know, what I will say is that children are often more likely to be adherent to their medications than adults are, but we lump children all into one age group as if treating a 6-month-old was the same as treating a 12-year-old. And I do think we need, you know, adherence strategies that are focused at each of the different age groups and address the challenges. You know, with a 2-year-old, they often clamp their mouths shut and run away, but with a 12-year-old, there may be issues around, you know, their changing psychology, their different roles in the community and in their lives, and that requires more subtlety and a light touch of you know, care for those children. So these are great. And Evgenia, if you could put up the next sort of chat window, which is if you have any advocacy efforts with which you're involved, please feel free to type these in here as well. And again, to also contact us outside of this webinar, my email address, I think you should all have, but if not, you can write to the Sentinel Project at their general email address, which is available on the website, and ask to be in contact with myself or Lindsay or Grania about, you know, pooling efforts around other advocacy work that's going on in the field. So I'll stop there, and as people continue to type, if there's any last words from our two wonderful presenters, Grania and Lindsay, before we end the webinar in just a few minutes.
I think, Jen, you've summed it up very nicely, and I think it is that we all need to work together and share our experiences, and as many voices will finally be heard.
Yeah, I think, you know, Jen and Grania.
Sorry, Lindsay, go ahead.
Jen, I was just going to say that I think both you and Grania. That's okay. I was just going to say you and Grania, you know, did a really great job fielding those questions. You know, it's exciting to see what's coming up here on the chat window about other advocacy efforts people are engaging in, and I think, you know, it's nice to really collaborate where we can to, you know, really bring these issues to the forefront and, you know, get the political will we need to really address pediatric TB.
And then I'll just make one last comment before we hand it back over to Evgenia, who deserves great thanks for hosting such a wonderful webinar. I'm very happy to see in the chat box about schooling and starting children back in school. I see some comments from King Dinuzulu that they run a school for their pediatric DRTB children, and I know in South Africa, Brooklyn Chest does the same. But we have to remember, and I fall into this habit often because I'm a clinician, these are not just sick children, these are children, and as much as possible they need to have normal lives return. And with TB, we know there's a great deal of stigma. These children are often kept away from school for you know, over-exaggerated fears of contagion. They're not allowed to play, and they really end up having lonely and hard lives. So I'm glad to see issues about getting these kids back in schools and back in their regular activities. And we know, based on some very interesting work that was just published in the International Journal of Tuberculosis and Lung Disease, Ed Nardell was the senior author, that once people are on effective therapy, their risk of transmission is very low, provided they're able to stay on that. So I'm glad to see this comment, and would like to close with remembering that kids are kids. They want to play with their friends. They want to go to school. And this also needs to be part of our advocacy efforts. So I'm going to turn back over to Evgenia to close us out now. And I just thank everyone for their interest, for the work you do for kids, and for joining